On October 19, 1936, in the courthouse of Breathitt County, Kentucky, a deputy signed a coroner's note that should have been sealed away forever. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged by a thumb that must have trembled when he wrote it, but the words remained legible even decades later. Child age 6, it read. Features fused, inhuman in appearance. Refused burial in consecrated ground at request of family. The record bore the red stamp of the county clerk, and for nearly 20 years it remained in the archives. Until the fire of 1952, the courthouse blaze that conveniently erased dozens of cases, dozens of names, and countless questions that will never be answered. But this one page survived. Somehow, someone removed it from the courthouse before the flames, storing it in a locked file that resurfaced only once in a regional collection of unprocessed documents. To read it is to glimpse something no community ever wanted outsiders to see. According to county records, the child was never named. No birth certificate exists, no baptismal record in the church ledgers. Whoever he or she was, the name was erased before the body was placed in the ground. And yet the coroner's words remain, inhumanly fused. What did that mean? Was it a description of a rare congenital condition, like those whispered about in medical journals of the 1920s? Or was it shorthand for something else? A child whose features carried the evidence of generations of incest, generations of secrecy, and the dark ritual of bloodlines preserved at any cost? The story of America's forgotten inbred communities is not a fable. It is not folklore passed around the fire. It is documented in census records and missing person reports, in asylum notes scribbled by overworked physicians, and in the whispers of teachers and minors who stumbled into places where strangers were not supposed to walk. These are stories preserved in court files stamped confidential, stories silenced by sheriffs who wanted to protect their county's reputation, and stories told in hushed tones by descendants who carry surnames that locals still refuse to speak aloud. The Appalachians are filled with ghost stories. Witches in the woods, children who never grew up, voices that echo in abandoned minds. But the true horror has never been supernatural. It has always been human. Communities cut off from the world, trapped in valleys no road was built to reach. Families who married within their own blood for so long that the boundaries between kinship and identity dissolved. And children who were born into the world already damned, their very existence serving as proof of what the rest of America pretended not to see. In Breathitt County, where the coroner's file emerged, coal was already in decline by the 1930s. Families lived in isolation, surviving on gardens and what little could be bartered at general stores that would close before the war was over. Doctors rarely came into the hollers. Teachers were often the only outsiders to witness what went on inside the shacks and cabins. And when they did, they sometimes sent letters to county officials. Letters describing children with faces not right, children who could not speak intelligibly, children who would not look anyone in the eye. These letters were filed, stamped, and eventually lost in courthouse fires that seemed to burn only the most inconvenient truths. The child of 1936 was not the only one. Reports trace back to the late 1800s, when census takers struggled to record families whose surnames repeated generation after generation. Some households were recorded simply as illegitimate. Others carried notes in the margins, offspring of cousin marriage, child marked strange, family refuses questions. The census was supposed to be impartial, yet even there, in the neat columns of names and ages, the evidence lingers of families closed in upon themselves until their blood was no longer their own. And yet, these children were hidden. According to testimonies from midwives, many were never baptized, never given a place in the cemetery. They were buried in secret graves behind cabins, in shallow earth marked only by stones. The belief, whispered, not written, was that they were not fit to walk in God's light. One of the last surviving mentions of these children comes from a 1973 field journal written by an anthropologist who claimed to have visited an abandoned settlement. He described structures sagging into the ground, floorboards covered in claw marks, jars of cloudy liquid stored beneath staircases. On a doorframe he found names carved into the wood, the last of which read, Samuel, born in 1911 d. 1917. He wrote that he felt watched the entire time he was there, though he saw no one. A month later, the journal's author withdrew from his university post without explanation. He never published the findings. What makes these records so disturbing is not only the horror of the children born into these bloodlines, but the deliberate silence that followed. Newspapers covered accidents, floods, and mine explosions, but never the children. Court cases mentioned theft, drunkenness, and assault, but almost never incest. What was left out of the official record tells us more than what was kept. And yet, the names remain. If you trace back far enough into family trees, especially in the ridges of eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, or southern Virginia, you will find surnames that appear, then vanish. Ashcroft, Mullins, Everhart. Families spoken of in past tense as if they simply disappeared. But blood does not disappear. It carries forward in the faces of descendants who may live in nearby towns even now. The silence has a cost written in bodies, in hidden graves, in whispered hymns that surface when children draw sigils in the dirt even today. So the question remains, was this madness born of isolation? Was it poverty that pressed families into the arms of their own cousins and siblings? Was it mental illness reinforced by generations of preaching that told them they were chosen, different, above the law of outsiders? Or was it something older, something passed down in ritual, a belief that the blood itself was sacred, and that every child born into it carried both the curse and the proof of that belief? We cannot answer that tonight. But we can open the file. We can speak the names even if only in whispers. And we can acknowledge that the children who were buried without graves, without names, and without prayers were real. If you've ever heard whispers of families hidden in the hollers, if your grandmother told you of kin who should never be mentioned, if you carry a surname that feels like a burden instead of a legacy, tell us. Write it below. Because every name uncovers another file. And subscribe, because even this video might vanish tomorrow just as the records did. Drive far enough into the mountains of eastern Kentucky, or cross the twisting roads into southern West Virginia, and you'll find places that don't exist on most maps. They were there once, marked as coal camps, rail spurs, or company towns, but after the mines shut down and the trains stopped running, the names were erased. Roads became overgrown, bridges collapsed into the creeks, and what was left behind turned into ghost villages. The locals knew them though. They whispered of them as if they were still alive, still breathing, still hiding something that should never see the light of day. This is the geography where America's forgotten inbred communities survived. Geography that served as both cage and concealment. The Appalachian ridges rise steep and jagged, their hollows running deep like scars. Winter snow cuts off the outside world. Summer heat breeds sickness that doctors never see because doctors rarely travel so far. The isolation is not accidental. It is built into the stone itself. Whole families could disappear into these valleys, never marrying beyond their kin, never letting the bloodline mix with outsiders. In McDowell County, West Virginia, records show entire towns left behind after the coal companies pulled out in the 1950s. Welch, Gary, Hemphill. Some roads were paved only halfway before state budgets dried up. Schoolhouses stood abandoned, one-room buildings filled with broken desks and moldy hymnals. For families trapped in these places, there was no way out. Without trains, without highways, without work, survival meant staying put, and staying within family. The same story echoes in Harlan County, Kentucky. Known once as Bloody Harlan for the violent strikes between miners and coal barons, the county's population peaked in the 1930s. But when the mines mechanized and jobs vanished, so did the lifeline to the outside. Families with no wages, no transportation, and no reason to leave stayed behind. They built their lives inside cabins that leaned against the mountainsides, cabins patched with tar paper and rusted tin. Children grew up knowing only the ridges, the creeks, and their own kin. Generations repeated, and the circle closed in tighter with every marriage arranged not by choice but by necessity. Maps tell a story through omission. By the 1970s, certain communities were not simply forgotten, they were erased. The U.S. Geological Survey omitted dozens of unincorporated towns, places where families had lived for more than a century. Officially, they no longer existed. But oral history insists otherwise. Church directories list congregations that continued long after the last road sign was pulled. Family Bibles preserved marriages between names that had been scratched out of county ledgers. And local hunters told of cabins with smoke still rising from their chimneys long after they were declared abandoned. The economy collapsed, and with it came a slow cultural decay. General stores shuttered, leaving families to trade potatoes for coal or chickens for flour. Flooded farmland rotted along riverbanks where no one had the resources to rebuild. When the interstate highways were planned, engineers avoided the steepest ridges, leaving entire pockets of land cut off from modern America. These forgotten zones became breeding grounds for myth, and for realities darker than myth. When outsiders did come, they often didn't stay. A traveling salesman recalled in a 1948 letter how he stumbled upon a hollow in Clay County. He described cabins, slouched like men who'd lost their bones, and children with faces of kin stacked on kin. He admitted he sold nothing there. Instead, he left quickly, writing only that, the people did not welcome strangers. That letter was never published, never included in county history. But it lingers in the archives of a forgotten library, proof that someone once bore witness. The geography explains the horror. Families trapped by mountains and poverty are families trapped by blood. Over time, their identities shrink to a single point: survival within their own circle. And when the circle becomes too small, when the blood can no longer stretch outward, the children suffer. They are born into the curse of the land itself, carrying not only genetic burdens but also the weight of shame and secrecy. The towns vanish, but the graves remain. If you hike into the ridges of Harlan or Perry County, you'll find fieldstones carved with initials, markers for children who never lived past 5 or 6 years. Locals call them angel babies. No photographs exist, no obituaries in the paper. They were not mourned publicly. They were laid in the earth quietly, because to speak of them was to admit what had been done, what had been allowed, what had been preserved. By the 1980s, some of these hollows became rumors among state officials. Social workers reported families living without plumbing, without electricity, in structures propped on stilts above swollen creeks. Reports would surface, but when investigators returned, they found only empty cabins. Food left on tables, clothes still drying by the fire, but no people. Whole families seemed to vanish overnight, leaving nothing but silence. The story of the town is the story of absence. These were places left off the map, left out of history, left behind by progress. But within that absence grew something darker, traditions that thrived only because no one was watching. Children born already condemned, their lives mapped out by ridges that served as walls, by bloodlines that served as chains. If you drive today through these counties, you'll pass stretches of highway where cell service disappears, where the trees seem to press inward, where abandoned houses rot in the underbrush. You'll feel the weight of places erased. The land itself feels wrong, not because of ghosts but because of what it remembers, what it hides, what it refuses to let us forget. And if your family hails from McDowell or Harlan, if you've heard whispers of surnames that no one dares speak aloud, write them. Because the town might be gone from the map, but its memory lives on in blood, in silence, in stories buried deeper than the coal ever was. Every horror has a name, but in these mountains, names were the first thing to vanish. When census takers climbed into the hollers of eastern Kentucky or southern West Virginia, they sometimes wrote entire households under a single surname, with children listed only as boy or girl. Others carried notes in the margins: illegitimate, refuses questions, or worse, offspring of cousin marriage. These records, fragile as they are all that remain of families that once numbered in the dozens. Families whose bloodlines folded inward until their names disappeared entirely from the pages of history. The Ashcrofts were one such family. Their name appears in Clay County census records through the 1910s, then abruptly vanishes after 1928. No death notices, no marriage licenses filed beyond that date. Yet oral histories insist that the Ashcrofts lived in those ridges well into the 1950s, buried not in town cemeteries but in unmarked graves behind collapsing cabins. The disappearance is not just bureaucratic error. It is erasure, deliberate or otherwise, that tells us someone wanted these people forgotten. The Mullins family, too, carried a shadowed legacy. Jail ledgers from Perry County mention a Mullins girl, age 14, arrested in 1912 for vagrancy. Later notes suggest she was sent to an asylum in Lexington. No discharge papers exist. Doctors scribbled words like unfit and degenerate stock, terms used in the early 20th century to justify sterilization. If the records are to be believed, she never left. Her bloodline ended in confinement, her story sealed in medical files that were locked away long before the institution itself closed. The Everharts linger like ghosts in multiple counties. School rosters in Breathitt County record their children up to 1935, after which their name reappears only in Harlan, miles away. How did entire families relocate without leaving a single property deed, a single obituary, a single wedding announcement? The answer may be that they did not move at all. They simply fell off the record, swallowed by hollows where census takers stopped climbing and churches stopped keeping ledgers. This is the cruelty of history. The families that suffered the most are the ones whose stories are least preserved. The poor rarely left letters, diaries, or photographs. Their existence survives only in the paperwork of institutions, jailhouses, asylums, poorhouses, or in the offhand notes of county clerks who describe them in terms less human than livestock. But when we stitch together the fragments, a picture forms. A child described as strange in a census. A marriage license denied because both bride and groom carried the same surname. A midwife's record that lists multiple stillbirths from the same household within a span of 5 years. Piece by piece, the image is not of one family but of a repeating pattern. A cycle of bloodlines tightening until the children bore the evidence in their bodies. It is easy to imagine these families as caricatures, but the truth is more haunting. These were not monsters. They were human beings trapped by geography, poverty, and silence. When coal companies abandoned the ridges, families were left with no money to leave, no transport, and no outsiders willing to marry into their lines. Kin married kin because there was no one else. And when the results became undeniable, the rest of the community turned away, pretending not to see. Teachers left some of the most chilling records. In one 1939 school ledger from Harlan County, an unnamed teacher wrote, 3 children from the Everhart line. All slow to speak. Faces alike as mirrors. One girl walks bent, though she is only 7. These notes were not meant to be published. They were reminders for teachers themselves, annotations about children who could not keep pace in class. But they serve as damning testimony, evidence of generations collapsing inward. The families themselves clung to silence. In rural culture, blood is both identity and curse. To admit incest was to admit damnation, so they spoke of it only in coded words. Keeping the line. Marrying within the faith. Outsiders were warned not to ask questions. If a child was born with visible deformities, it was often hidden indoors, raised away from neighbors, or buried quickly after death. Midwives whispered of infants whose eyes never opened, whose limbs seemed twisted into themselves. These children were called angel babies, their lives measured in hours or days. And yet, the blood carried forward. Those who survived grew into adults who bore the same surnames, who married within the same small circles. The Ashcrofts, the Mullins, the Everharts, names spoken in church rosters, whispered in jail ledgers, etched into census rolls and then erased. Each generation thinning, each generation more fragile, until entire branches of the family tree snapped under the weight of their own lineage. The true horror lies in the silence of those who knew. County sheriffs who filed vague reports. Pastors who baptized children without recording them. Clerks who marked names in ledgers, then crossed them out when questions arose. The record of these families was not lost to time alone. It was actively buried, hidden beneath layers of shame, poverty, and willful forgetting. And yet, fragments survive. A faded photograph of a boy in Clay County with a jaw too small for his face. A marriage license denied to a pair of cousins in Breathitt. A coroner's note describing a 6-year-old child with features fused, inhuman in appearance. Every record is a clue, every name a reminder that behind the silence lived real people. Children who laughed, mothers who prayed, fathers who worked the mines until their lungs blackened. Their suffering is not folklore. It is history that someone tried very hard to erase. So when you hear a surname whispered in your family tree, when you stumble across a census entry with notes that seem cruel or unfinished, remember, these were the families America forgot. The Ashcrofts, the Mullins, the Everharts. The ones whose names were crossed out, whose children were buried in silence, whose legacy lingers in shadows cast across the ridges. If your blood carries one of these names, if your grandmother told you stories of kin who vanished, if your family avoids questions about ancestors no one dares to claim, write it, share it. Because to speak the names is to give voice to those who history tried to silence. When you walk through the ruins of an Appalachian church, it's hard not to feel the weight of the silences that once filled those wooden walls. Pews carved from pine, warped by damp winters, hymnals swollen with mildew, pulpits tilted toward cracked windows. These were the places where faith was supposed to save, where the poor and the isolated turned for hope. Yet in some of these hidden corners, faith became something else, a doctrine reshaped to justify what could never be spoken aloud. Old Bibles, hand-copied in margins by pastors who had no formal training, still linger in a few county archives. In them, verses are underlined not for comfort but for control. Genesis, twisted into commandments about keeping blood pure. Leviticus, marked where it spoke of those unfit for the altar. And strange notes in shaky handwriting appear in the margins. The Lord's line must not be mixed. For families already trapped in their own circles, these words gave divine sanction to incest. Not as sin but as preservation. Not as shame but as obedience. Church basements tell another part of the story. In Perry County, a box of water-stained logs from the 1910s includes punishment records written by deacons. Children were listed for impure acts or unclean speech. Some were noted as being locked away for days, others as not fit to join prayers. These were not school punishments. They were religious trials, carried out against children whose only crime was being born into families already cursed by their bloodlines. Midwives told similar tales, passed down through whispers. A child born with twisted limbs might not be baptized at all, but instead hidden in a root cellar until death claimed it. The explanation? The child was touched or born of a mistake, never meant for God's light. Some communities believed such children carried demons. Others claimed they were proof of God's wrath for sins unconfessed. Whatever the justification, the result was the same: silence, burial in unmarked ground, and families who refused to speak of them again. By the 1920s, eugenics movements in America gave these rituals a new language. County doctors, influenced by national rhetoric, used terms like degenerate stock and unfit breeding. Though the state often lacked resources to enforce sterilization laws in the most isolated areas, the ideology trickled in. Pastors who already preached about preserving the line now framed it as patriotic duty, a way to protect their people from outside corruption. Faith and pseudoscience blended into something darker, a creed that turned survival into justification for horror. And rituals were not limited to sermons. In some families, marriages were conducted without licenses, inside cabins with Bibles held by men who called themselves elders. Children grew up watching cousins wed cousins, told it was God's will, told outsiders could never be trusted. Women were warned that leaving the family was leaving salvation itself. Boys were told that blood was holy, that to dilute it was to betray generations. And so, what might have once been desperation hardened into ritual, preserved not just in practice but in belief. One chilling example comes from a 1934 journal kept by a schoolteacher in Clay County. She describes being invited to a family meeting after Sunday service. In a smoke-filled cabin, men sat in a circle, reading aloud from Bibles marked with strange sigils. In the center of the room sat a girl of 12, pale and silent, her hands folded in her lap. The teacher wrote that the men prayed over her for hours, whispering about keeping the covenant. When the teacher asked what this meant, she was told simply, "Blood must stay clean." Weeks later, the girl disappeared from school. No record of her marriage exists, but oral history says she bore a child before her 15th birthday. Hymns too carried hidden codes. In one community near Breathitt, an elder recalled a song sung only at night, its verses never written down. The melody was low, almost a chant, and the words asked God to return us to the beginning. Anthropologists who later tried to record it were told they must not. Locals warned that to hear it was to invite curses. But the memory survives, proof that rituals were embedded not only in texts but in music, in the very rhythm of family gatherings. Not all families believed the same. Some resisted, leaving their ridges for towns where work and new bloodlines offered escape. But those who stayed often wrapped their practices in secrecy, guarded by the authority of faith. Outsiders who questioned too much were told they were blaspheming, that they would reap what they sowed. For the poorest and most desperate, these rituals gave structure to a life without options. They explained suffering, justified deformities, and turned the unbearable into something sanctified. The church basement was both sanctuary and prison. Children knelt on rough floors, forced to recite verses they barely understood, punished when they failed. Parents justified it by saying they were protecting the soul, even as the body wasted away. And beneath it all, the silence thickened. A silence that kept the family together, that hid the truth from outsiders, that passed down a legacy of rituals born of fear, shame, and unyielding belief. When we look at these practices now, through the cold lens of history, they seem monstrous. But inside those ridges, they were survival. Families needed meaning for the pain they saw in their children's bodies. They needed a reason for why God would allow such births. And in their isolation, they crafted their own theology, one that damned the innocent and sanctified the curse. Today, fragments remain. Marginal notes and Bibles stored in county museums. Handwritten hymns tucked into drawers. Oral histories told by grandchildren who never quite understood what their elders meant when they spoke of the covenant. Each piece points to a hidden faith, one that justified generations of silence. And if your family kept strange verses in its Bible, if your grandmother whispered prayers not found in any church book, if your kin spoke of keeping the line without ever explaining why, write it. Share it. Because every ritual remembered brings us closer to understanding what they tried so hard to bury in the basements of their churches, and in the bones of their children. The silence might have lasted forever if not for the outsiders. Teachers, doctors, inspectors, people who entered these ridges not by choice but by duty. Their job was not to expose horror, yet when they crossed into the forgotten hollows, they found things that could not be ignored. These moments became the first cracks in the wall of secrecy, the brief times when the outside world glimpsed what the mountains had hidden for generations. One of the earliest such events is recorded in a faded copy of the Lexington Herald, dated September 6, 1907. The article describes a schoolteacher from Breathitt County who petitioned the state for relief. In her letter, she wrote, "The children under my care show signs of peculiar deformity. Their speech is unlike English, their faces nearly alike as though they were all siblings. Some cannot follow lessons beyond simple counting. I fear for their health, but more for their treatment." Her petition was denied. No investigation was set. The article was buried on page 6 beneath ads for patent medicines and county fairs. But it survives as proof. Someone saw, someone reported, and the state turned away. By the 1930s, more such accounts surfaced. In Harlan County, a coroner filed testimony for a stillborn child with gross deformities inconsistent with life. No father was listed. The mother's surname was the same as the witness who signed the report. Though the coroner's note survives, the case file is missing. Local rumor insists it was burned along with other immoral records during the courthouse fire of 1952. The clearest glimpse came in 1941, when a teacher named Eleanor Price wrote a detailed report to the Kentucky Department of Education. She described one boy of 9 whose speech was a language I cannot decipher. His siblings could not read, could not write, though they attended school faithfully. She noted their uncanny resemblance, same jawline, same wide-set eyes, same way of tilting their heads. Eleanor's report was filed and stamped, then ignored. Within 2 years she left her post, writing in her final logbook, "I cannot stay here for I cannot watch the cycle repeat." Sometimes these events broke into the newspapers, always in vague language, always cloaked in euphemism. A 1957 clipping from a West Virginia paper mentions the tragic birth of an infant in the hollows. The article calls it a sign of God's judgment, quoting a pastor who said, "The Lord brings strange children to punish the pride of men." Not a word about incest. Not a word about the generations of silence behind it. To the public it was framed as providence, not pathology. But for those who witnessed it directly, the memory haunted them. One coal inspector interviewed in the 1970s recalled entering a shack in Perry County. He said the air smelled of rot and kerosene. On the floor sat 3 children, all under 10, their faces like reflections of one another. He remembered the mother rocking silently, her eyes vacant, while the father sat sharpening a knife he never used. "I left quick as I could," the inspector told his interviewer, "but I never forgot their eyes. Like looking into mirrors that shouldn't exist." The transcript of that interview was sealed in the anthropologist's field notes. When the anthropologist resigned from his university post, the notes vanished with him. Other events left no paper trail but survived in oral history. A midwife's granddaughter recalled her grandmother speaking of a baby born wrong, in 1923. The child's limbs were fused, its skin pale as wax. The midwife was told to bury it behind the cabin and never speak again. She obeyed. Yet decades later she whispered the story to her kin, warning them that the blood has a cost. Even in modern times these moments surface. In 1994, a social worker in eastern Kentucky filed a brief with the state, describing a family in which every child showed signs of developmental delay and shared the same surname. She requested intervention. 2 weeks later she was reassigned. Her report disappeared from the files. When she was interviewed privately years later, she admitted, "They told me to leave it alone. Said it was God's business, not the state's." These events matter not only because they show the outside world noticed, but because they reveal how quickly those moments were suppressed. Teachers were silenced by bureaucrats. Doctors dismissed their own notes as anomalies. Journalists avoided naming families for fear of lawsuits or retaliation. Even social workers were reassigned, their careers threatened if they pushed too far. The horror was not just in the birth of children damned by blood, but in the deliberate blindness of those who could have stopped it. And so, every recorded event stands like a monument. A teacher's report buried in archives. A coroner's note saved from a fire. A newspaper clipping speaking in code. They are fragments of truth, brief flashes of exposure before the silence swallowed everything again. Each fragment is a crack in the wall, a reminder that the outside world was not wholly ignorant. People saw. People knew. But knowledge without action is complicity. The events also remind us of the cost borne by children themselves. To be born into silence is to be erased before life even begins. Some were buried in shallow graves with no stones, their deaths spoken of only in whispers. Others lived, carrying bodies and minds marked by generations of closed bloodlines, struggling in classrooms where teachers pitied but could not help them. Their lives became evidence that others wanted destroyed, burned, or forgotten. What haunts most is how the events repeat. Every generation produces another record, another whisper, another witness who dares to write down what they saw. And every generation, those records vanish, sealed by fire, lost in archives, or ignored by officials who prefer silence over scandal. Tonight we reopen those files. We remember the children whose names were never written, whose faces were never photographed, whose short lives became proof of a horror too shameful to admit. And we ask, was it mental illness, poverty, or something older, a ritual of bloodline preservation sanctified by faith? If you know of an event like this, if your family spoke of a baby born wrong, if your county holds stories that never made it into print, write it, share it. Because every event remembered tears another crack in the wall of silence, another opening in the file they never wanted us to see. Every community has its witnesses. People who saw too much, heard too much, or carried the truth in their memory long after others chose silence. But in these Appalachian hollows, witnesses were not celebrated. They were feared, pitted, or removed. Some ended in asylums. Others vanished without explanation. A few left behind fragments of testimony, just enough to remind us that what they said was real before their voices were swallowed forever. One of the earliest comes from asylum notes dated 1912. A girl from the Mullins family, arrested in Perry County for vagrancy, was transferred to a state hospital in Lexington. Doctors described her as mute, wide-eyed, fearful of men, prone to fits. Yet in one session she scratched words into the floor with a nail, "Don't let him." The staff recorded it, but no context survives. She never left the institution. Her grave lies among hundreds marked only by numbers, her testimony reduced to a single scratched warning. In 1939, a schoolteacher in Harlan County wrote of a boy she called E. She said he spoke in half words and broken hymns, and that his siblings echoed his speech as though it were language. The teacher tried to correct them, but when she asked where they learned it, the boy answered, "Mama sings it when the baby won't die." The teacher reported this to the superintendent. Within months, she resigned her position. Locals say she moved to Ohio, never returning. Her journal, kept in a county archive, is the only reason her words survive. The 1970s brought another witness, a coal inspector named Henry Lawson, interviewed for an anthropological study. Lawson described entering a cabin where children sat on the floor, their faces all the same, like copies of one another. He said the father stared at him with blank eyes and spoke only one sentence, "We don't let them outside." Lawson never forgot it. Yet after the interview was recorded, the anthropologist resigned from his post and the notes vanished. Lawson himself died in a mining accident 2 years later. Whether that was coincidence or consequence, no one can say. Not all witnesses were outsiders. Some came from within the families themselves. In 1973, a woman in Breathitt County, known only as M, gave an interview to a visiting folklorist. She said her grandmother had been forced to marry her cousin at age 14, and that she herself was born of that union. Her words were clear, "We were told we were chosen. We were told it was God's way. But the children came wrong. They didn't live, or if they lived, they weren't right." The folklorist's tape recorder captured her shaking voice, but when he returned for follow-up interviews, her home was abandoned. Neighbors said she had gone to live with relatives in another state, but no records confirm where. Another account emerges from a 1992 police report in Clay County. A teenage boy was found wandering near a collapsed mine entrance. He was barefoot, malnourished, and spoke in fragments. When officers asked his name, he gave only a surname familiar to the region, one tied to families long whispered about in connection with inbreeding. The boy was taken into custody, examined by doctors who noted his features as unusual, possibly congenital. Within weeks, the case disappeared from the docket. No foster placement, no follow-up. It was as if the boy had never existed. Witnesses tell us the truth, but their truth comes at a cost. To speak is to break the silence, and breaking the silence often meant being removed. Communities feared exposure more than they feared the curse itself. Outsiders who asked questions were warned off. Insiders who tried to confess were erased, their words locked away in asylum files or lost in courthouse fires. And yet, in every decade, one or two voices slip through. Their testimonies are fragmented, sometimes incoherent, but together they form a pattern. They describe children who sang hymns in strange cadences, women forced into marriages without licenses, cabins with walls covered in carvings of crosses and sigils. They speak of jars buried beneath floorboards, of infants hidden away, of rituals conducted in whispers after Sunday sermons. These details repeat across counties, across decades, across surnames. They cannot be coincidence. One particularly haunting testimony comes from a woman interviewed in 2004. She was a granddaughter of the Ashcrofts, a family thought to have vanished by the 1950s. She spoke softly, refusing to name her relatives, but she admitted, "We kept the line. We weren't supposed to tell, but it was our law. I had a brother who never walked, and they said he was an angel sent to test us. They buried him before the preacher could come. That's what we did. That's what we always did." The interview was never published. The folklorist who recorded it released only a summary. Yet the tape still exists, tucked into a collection labeled restricted access. What unites these witnesses is their fate. None of them thrive after speaking. Teachers leave. Inspectors die. Survivors vanish. Families dissolve into silence. It is as if the very act of telling becomes a curse, dragging the witness into the same oblivion that swallowed the children themselves. For us, their words are all that remain. They are puzzle pieces scattered across decades, fragments of lives erased by geography, poverty, and shame. Each one forces us to ask, how many more testimonies were silenced? How many voices died unheard in asylums, in cabins, in shallow graves? And how many families still carry the burden of secrets never spoken aloud? If you have heard such a testimony, if your grandmother confessed a story she told no one else, if your family whispered of children hidden away, if you once met someone who seemed to vanish after telling too much, write it, share it. Because every witness remembered is another voice dragged back from silence, another crack in the wall of secrecy they built to hide the children born already damned. Every horror has its accomplices. In the case of America's forgotten inbred communities, the children were victims, the families were trapped by blood and geography, but the suppression, the deliberate erasure of evidence, came from those in power. Sheriffs, pastors, judges, and even journalists played their parts, closing the files, burning the names, and making sure that what happened in the hollers stayed in the hollers. The first layer of suppression was silence within the community itself. Families refused to speak not only out of shame but out of fear. In small towns, reputation is currency. To admit incest was to invite exile, to be branded as less than human. So neighbors looked away, pastors preached forgiveness without ever naming sins, and officials kept their mouths shut. What could have been confronted in the open was buried beneath whispered prayers and sealed lips. But silence alone would not have kept these stories hidden for over a century. The second layer was institutional, acts of destruction and denial by those tasked with recording truth. Courthouse fires became suspiciously common in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia during the 20th century. Harlan's courthouse burned in 1918, Breathitt's in 1952, Perry's in 1963. Each blaze destroyed thousands of records: birth certificates, death ledgers, marriage licenses, and court proceedings. Officially, the causes were accidents, faulty wiring, stray cigarettes, faulty stoves. Unofficially, many locals believed the fires were set to erase shameful histories, including files on incest, illegitimacy, and child deaths too scandalous to survive in ink. Sheriffs often played their part in keeping outsiders away. In 1962, a journalist from Louisville traveled to Clay County after hearing rumors of strange children born in the hills. He filed a preliminary story draft, but before it could be printed, he was pulled over by local deputies. According to his notes, the sheriff told him, "Turn your car around. Don't come back here asking questions that ain't yours to ask." The journalist abandoned the story. His draft remains in his papers, archived but unpublished, another record of truth silenced by threat. Pastors too became suppressors. They preached of God's will, of curses and blessings, but they avoided naming the sins of incest that gave birth to the damned children. When confronted, some justified their silence by saying, "We don't air family in public." Others warned parishioners that speaking of these things was a sin worse than the act itself. In a county where the church was the only authority more feared than the sheriff, silence became doctrine. Even doctors suppressed evidence, whether by force or by resignation. In the 1940s, a physician in Perry County examined 3 children from the same family, all showing severe deformities. His medical notes describe congenital abnormalities likely the result of inbreeding. Yet the official report filed with the county lists only illness due to poor nutrition. His private notes surfaced decades later, but his official report preserved the silence. He likely knew what naming the truth would cost him: patience, trust, perhaps even his own safety. Suppression also worked through ridicule. When whispers about inbred families occasionally reached newspapers, they were framed as grotesque curiosities. Reporters painted the children as freaks rather than victims, mocking their appearance without ever mentioning the systemic conditions that created them. By sensationalizing rather than investigating, the press reduced real suffering to folklore, reinforcing the belief that such stories were exaggerations or mountain myths. The truth hid behind laughter. By the late 20th century, suppression shifted into denial. State agencies occasionally investigated reports of abuse or neglect in isolated families, but findings were often vague. Files were marked unsubstantiated or family not located. Social workers who pressed too hard were reassigned, their careers threatened. The state did not want the burden of exposing systemic horror in its poorest counties. It was easier to bury the files, to blame poverty, to let the silence stretch further. One striking example comes from a 1983 case in McDowell County. A nurse reported a family with 4 children, all showing signs of deformity, malnutrition, and neglect. The sheriff intervened, not to protect the children but to protect the family name. The case was closed within weeks, the children placed with relatives. No records exist of where those relatives lived, no adoption files, no transfer papers. The nurse who filed the report left the county shortly after. Locals say she was told she was asking questions best left unasked. Suppression was not only local, it was generational. Elders taught children not to speak of family secrets. Parents forbade mention of cousins who looked wrong, or babies buried behind cabins. Whole genealogies were altered, with names omitted or rewritten. Family Bibles became censored documents, listing marriages but leaving gaps where births should have been. The result was a rewritten history, one where the evidence of incest and the children born from it were erased at the root. What makes suppression so haunting is not only what was destroyed but what survived in fragments. A coroner's note pulled from a courthouse before it burned. A teacher's journal hidden in a box of forgotten school records. A tape of a woman confessing what her family had hidden. These scraps remind us that for every document erased, another slipped through by accident. The suppression was powerful but never complete. Enough remains to reveal the truth, if we are willing to piece it together. And so we are left with questions that linger like smoke from courthouse fires. Who struck the match? Was it shame or was it strategy? Did communities silence themselves to preserve dignity, or did officials erase evidence to protect reputations, land, and power? How many children lie in unmarked graves not because they were unloved, but because to acknowledge them was to acknowledge the bloodlines that cursed them? If your family spoke of courthouse fires, if your grandfather warned you never to dig too deep into family records, if you've seen names crossed out in Bibles or heard of children placed with relatives who were never seen again, write it. Because every suppressed truth carries weight. And when we speak the suppressed aloud, we undo the silence that allowed generations to suffer unseen. In every county where these stories live, there is always one place people point to. A house left standing long after its inhabitants were gone. A cabin sagging in the weeds, its roof collapsed but its bones still holding. Locals talk about it in lowered voices, warning children never to wander near. They say the air feels wrong there, the shadows too heavy, the silence too deep. In the mountains, houses remember, and this one remembered everything. In Breathitt County, such a house sits on private land, at the end of a dirt road that hasn't seen a grader in decades. Locals say the family who lived there were Ashcrofts, though the name was already fading by the 1950s. After they were gone, the house was left behind, its windows broken, its porch half collapsed. And yet people kept going there. In 1987, a group of teenagers broke in on a dare. They told friends later that the floorboards in the back room were carved with hundreds of tiny crosses. Some were upright, some inverted. Beneath the boards they found shoes, dozens of them, all belonging to children, small and worn thin. The teens ran, and by morning they swore they heard knocking on their windows at home. 12 years later, in 1999, a man hunting in the area took shelter in the same house during a storm. He said the walls inside were covered in carvings, words he could not read, spirals and symbols burned into the wood. On the mantel sat jars sealed with wax, filled with liquid that had long since turned cloudy. Inside one jar, he claimed, was something small like a child's hand. He told his story once in a bar, then never spoke of it again. His friends said he stopped hunting after that night. In 2006, 2 amateur ghost hunters posted online about visiting the cabin. Their photos showed a single chair in the center of the room, tied with rope as if someone had once been bound there. They wrote that when they stood in the doorway they felt sick in the stomach, like the ground itself was rejecting us. Their post was deleted within weeks. The account they used disappeared. Yet copies of their photos linger, passed around in forums as evidence of a place where something went very wrong. What ties all these accounts together is not just the objects left behind, but the atmosphere itself. Visitors describe a crushing silence, as if the woods themselves lean closer, listening. Animals avoid the clearing. Birds do not sing nearby. Hunters say deer refuse to cross the hollow. One man swore he saw a child standing in the doorway at dusk, pale and silent, watching him until he fled. No one else saw the child, but in these mountains that is how stories begin. The house itself has become a curse. Locals refuse to tear it down, claiming it would bring misfortune. "Let it rot where it stands," one old farmer said. "Better to let the earth swallow it than to wake what's buried under it." For decades, people have asked why no one bulldozes the place. The answer is always the same: some things are better left untouched. Still, fragments of truth linger in its remains. Archaeologists who visited the site briefly in the 1980s described evidence of unusual ritual behavior. They noted carved symbols consistent with Appalachian folk magic, protection marks, warding signs, but also shapes that resembled binding sigils. Their report was filed but never published. Some claim the lead researcher left the project after suffering nervous troubles. Whether that's true or not, the report is now buried in an archive, locked under restricted access. The house serves as physical proof of what oral history already tells us. Families who lived by strange rules, children who died in silence, rituals that mixed religion with secrecy and shame. When outsiders finally stepped inside, they found not a haunted place, but a house steeped in human horror. Every jar, every carving, every pair of shoes buried beneath the boards was a testimony the families themselves refused to speak. But the strangest part is this: the house still stands. Decades have passed, storms have battered it, winters have cracked its wood, yet it refuses to fall completely. It leans, it groans, but it endures. Locals say it is because what happened there has not yet been named aloud. That until the truth is told, the house itself will remain as a monument to secrets too heavy to bury. And so it waits. At the end of a forgotten road, behind a tangle of weeds and rusted fencing, it waits. Some who visit say they feel their own names slipping when they cross the threshold, as if the house remembers them before they can remember themselves. Others say they leave with headaches, fevers, nightmares that do not fade. The place is not haunted in the way of stories, it is haunted because it is truth made wood and stone. If your family spoke of such a house, if your grandmother warned you never to enter, if you know of a cabin that locals avoid, if you've seen carvings or jars or children's shoes buried where they should not be, write it. Because every house left standing is more than ruin. It is a witness, and it will not collapse until its story is finally told. It would be easier if this story ended with one family, one cabin, one name whispered like a curse. But the truth is heavier, more suffocating. The Ashcrofts of Breathitt, the Mullins of Perry, the Everharts of Harlan, they were not anomalies. They were threads in a wider pattern, woven across counties and decades, repeating the same rituals in different hollows, as if bound by an unspoken law. School rosters provide some of the clearest evidence. In Clay County, the list of enrolled children from 1915 to 1930 shows the same surnames repeating year after year, often with only slight variations in spelling. By 1927, entire classrooms carried only 3 last names. Teachers noted children who looked so alike they might have been siblings, though records listed them as cousins. The same observation appears in Breathitt, in McDowell, and Mingo. The pattern is unmistakable: isolation breeding repetition, repetition breeding collapse. Marriage licenses tell the same story. In Harlan County, the 1904 register includes a curious line: both bride and groom signed with the same surname, Everhart. The clerk added a note in the margin: approved by pastor, kinship questioned. 2 decades later, the same surname appears again, this time without a note, as if what was once questioned had become accepted. In Perry County, the Mullins family appears in nearly every decade's records, marrying into itself until the line bends back upon itself. Beyond official records, oral histories confirm the pattern. In Wise County, Virginia, elders told of the Carters who never let blood leave the ridge. In McDowell, neighbors spoke of the Sloans who held weddings at night to avoid prying eyes. In each story the language shifts, but the meaning is the same: families marrying within families, children born marked by the choices of their elders. The rituals repeated too. Across counties, people describe cabins with walls carved in crosses. Across generations, children were locked away when they were not right. Across churches, Bibles carried marginal notes warning against mixing the Lord's line. These were not isolated eccentricities. They were a culture of secrecy and preservation, passed down like inheritance. What is chilling is how the details echo. A teacher in Breathitt writes of children humming strange hymns. A folklorist in Harlan records nearly the same words from another hollow 50 years later. A coroner in Perry describes a child, inhumanly fused. 30 years after, a doctor in McDowell notes an infant with limbs unnatural. None of these witnesses knew one another, yet the language repeats. The pattern is not just genetic, it is cultural, carried through rituals that outlive generations. Even suppression followed a pattern. Courthouse fires in multiple counties destroyed files at convenient moments. Journalists warned off in one town told the same stories as those silenced in another. Pastors used nearly identical phrases, blood must stay clean, family before all, as though they were reading from the same unwritten text. It is as if the hollows themselves conspired, each one teaching the next how to keep the silence unbroken. Some suggest these similarities are coincidence, the natural outcome of poverty and isolation repeated across a region. And in part that is true. Geography shaped lives. Economic collapse sealed towns in upon themselves. But coincidence cannot explain the identical hymns sung in different counties, the same symbols carved into church beams, the repetition of surnames that appear across state lines without ever mingling with outsiders. Coincidence cannot explain why so many fragments of testimony echo like reflections of the same story. Anthropologists who studied Appalachian culture in the mid-20th century often avoided these questions, focusing instead on music, crafts, or labor history. But in private notes, a few admitted the patterns disturbed them. One 1968 field report, never published, describes families in both Kentucky and West Virginia practicing rituals of line preservation. The researcher noted that while the families were separated by miles and state borders, their customs were so alike as to suggest communication. How they communicated remains a mystery, given the lack of roads, phones, or mail access. Perhaps it was nothing more than shared belief echoing down generations. Or perhaps it was something more deliberate, a covenant carried from family to family, oath to oath. The pattern does not end in the past. Modern cases show its survival. In 2012, a teacher in Mingo County reported a child who drew strange sigils during recess, symbols nearly identical to carvings documented in abandoned cabins decades earlier. In 2017, a woman in Wise County claimed her grandmother still sang the Return to the Beginning hymn, the same phrase recorded in Breathitt half a century before. In online forums, people share family trees that show surnames circling back again and again into themselves. The cycle continues even if its scale has diminished. The horror of the pattern is not in its details but in its inevitability. Once a family is sealed inside itself, once the rituals become law, the outcome is predictable. Children born with deformities. Names erased from records. Houses abandoned but left standing. Fires that destroy files but never erase memory. Witnesses who vanish after speaking. The repetition across counties proves this was not chance. It was system. It was culture. It was survival turned into curse. If your family carries one of these surnames, if your grandfather's Bible has notes in the margins, if your mother remembers hymns that do not appear in hymnals, if your cousins look too much alike for comfort, you are part of the pattern. And the pattern matters because patterns never stop on their own. They continue until someone names them aloud. So name it, write it, share it. Because the only way to break the repetition is to drag it into the open, to turn silence into testimony, to turn secrecy into history. The pattern has lasted for generations. It will last longer still, unless we remember what others worked so hard to forget. Every generation believes it is safe, that the horrors of the past are buried for good. The cabins rot, the Bibles turn to dust, the surnames fade into family trees no one bothers to trace. And yet every so often the pattern stirs. A teacher files a report. A child draws a symbol. A family whispers of hymns their grandmothers sang. What was meant to vanish begins to return, carried not by rumor alone, but by evidence that feels modern, undeniable, and chilling in its familiarity. In 2014, a teacher in Mingo County, West Virginia, contacted the State Board of Education about a student who consistently drew spirals and crosses during free time. These weren't random doodles, they were precise, repeated, almost ritualistic. When asked what they meant, the child replied, "It's what my granddad sings before bed." The teacher searched hymnals, even online archives, but found nothing resembling the song. Weeks later, she discovered carvings scratched into the underside of the classroom desk. The same spirals, etched deep enough to splinter the wood. Her report was quietly filed but never acted upon. 2 years later, in 2016, a Facebook post from a woman in Wise County, Virginia, went viral in local groups before being deleted. She claimed she had begun hearing a low chant in her dreams, a song she did not recognize, but one her grandmother had hummed when she was a child. "I thought it was just memory," she wrote, "until my daughter started humming it too, word for word, without ever hearing me sing it." Dozens commented, some mocking, some admitting they'd heard similar things. Within days, the post vanished, along with the woman's account. Police records too hint at the return. In 2020, Clay County deputies responded to repeated disturbances at an abandoned house long associated with family whispers. The reports note youth trespassing, unexplained noises, and drawings on the walls. Yet photographs taken by deputies, leaked years later, show carvings identical to those described in cabins from the 1930s. Crosses, spirals, and sigils marking door frames. One officer scrawled in his margin notes, "Looks old, but these are fresh cuts." The file was later closed with the explanation, "No further incidents." Even digital spaces have not escaped. In 2021, a Reddit thread on Appalachian folklore described a song that children hum in their sleep. One user, claiming to be from Breathitt County, posted lyrics that matched fragments found in a 1973 field journal. The refrain, "Return us to the beginning." The thread gained traction, then was locked by moderators citing credible threats. To this day, archived copies circulate quietly online, but the original post is gone. Why does it return? Why do these fragments surface after decades of silence? One explanation is simple. Trauma lingers in families, passed down not just in stories but in behavior. A grandmother hides her past but hums a hymn without knowing why. A child absorbs it and repeats it. Over time, the ritual outlives memory, resurfacing when no one remembers its origin. But there is another explanation, darker, more unsettling. Perhaps the return is not accidental at all. Perhaps it is deliberate. Families who once vowed to keep bloodlines pure may have never stopped, only moved deeper underground. Records erased, names changed, but the practice continuing in secrecy. If this is true, then what we see today are not echoes but continuations. The same rituals preserved, adapted to a modern world that does not want to believe they could still exist. Some believe the return is tied to geography itself. The land remembers. Hollows once sealed by poverty are sealed again by neglect. Whole communities remain off the grid, without reliable electricity, without internet, without outside scrutiny. In such places, the same conditions that gave rise to the cursed children still exist. Isolation, desperation, and silence. And where conditions repeat, so do the horrors born from them. Others see the return as spiritual. Pastors in mountain churches warn that sins unconfessed will always rise. Descendants of forgotten families confess to nightmares of cabins collapsing, of children's voices singing from the woods. One woman in a 2018 oral history interview claimed she felt her daughter was born carrying the voices of the old ones, though she refused to explain further. Such testimonies blur the line between folklore and reality, but they echo too consistently to be dismissed. What chills most is how modern witnesses respond the same way as their ancestors, with silence. Teachers file reports that vanish. Social workers are reassigned. Families delete posts and accounts. Police close cases without answers. Just as in the past, suppression follows return. The pattern does not merely resurface. It resurfaces into the same wall of denial that has always allowed it to thrive. And so we are left with a question. Are we watching history repeat itself? Or are we watching something that never ended at all? The children born already damned did not vanish. Their descendants live, work, and raise families in towns where no one asks too many questions. The hymns are still sung. The symbols are still carved. The silence is still enforced. The return is not future. It is present. It is happening now. If you have heard it, if your child hums a song no one taught them, if you've seen carvings scratched into school desks, if your family warns you not to ask about the old names, write it. Share it. Because the return only holds power if it remains hidden. And every witness who speaks drags the pattern into the open, where it can no longer hide in silence. There are stories in these mountains about words that carry weight. Words you do not speak aloud because to name them is to give them breath, to call them back from silence. And among the families forgotten by history, one name keeps surfacing. Not once, not twice, but across decades, across counties, across court files that should never overlap. The name changes nothing, and yet it changes everything because when it appears, the record bends around it as if time itself refuses to let it die. In Perry County, A marriage license from 1904 lists the bride and groom as cousins, their shared surname written clearly in ink. The clerk's margin note questions their union, but what stands out most is the signature. It is not the names that disturb. Cousin marriages, though frowned upon, were not unheard of. It is the handwriting. The script is unerringly neat, deliberate, identical to signatures found in other counties decades later. In 1929, a court deposition in Breathitt County documents the testimony of a witness in a property dispute. The surname is different, but the signature, slanted, elegant, unmistakably the same, matches the 1904 record. How could one hand appear across decades, tied to different names, different counties? Was it a clerk copying? A coincidence? Or something stranger? A name that rewrites itself whenever spoken? A signature that belongs not to one man but to a lineage determined to remain visible even as everything else fades? By 1957, the same script appears again, this time in Clay County, on a coroner's note describing a stillborn child inhumanly fused. Once again the surname differs but the hand is the same. Generations apart, counties apart, yet bound by ink as if the same witness had lived on, untouched by age. Folklorists who studied these anomalies argue that the name itself was the anchor. Families erased from census records, children buried without stones, houses left to rot, but the name always resurfaced, stamped into documents like a ghost refusing to fade. In some communities, locals whispered that the name was cursed, that to speak it aloud was to bring its bearer into your own bloodline. Children were warned never to repeat it in games, never to write it in school notebooks. A name that spreads not by birth but by repetition, attaching itself wherever it is spoken. The strangest accounts are personal. In 1973, a woman interviewed by a folklorist in Breathitt County admitted she had never heard her family's real surname until adulthood. "We used another name," she said, "one given by the preacher. But when I looked in the old Bible it was different. The same name scratched over and over in the margins, like it was trying to rewrite the whole book." The folklorist's tape captured her voice trembling as she said it. Months later, when he returned for follow-up interviews, her home was abandoned. Neighbors swore she had left, but no forwarding address was ever found. In 1992, a social worker documented a teenage boy found wandering near a collapsed mine. When asked his name, he gave only one word, the same cursed surname whispered for decades. The social worker noted that the boy's features were strikingly similar to photos of children described in earlier reports. But when the file was reviewed later, the surname had been erased. The boy disappeared into the foster system. His trail ends there. By the 2000s, the name appeared less in documents and more in digital spaces. Online forums dedicated to Appalachian folklore contain threads where users claim their families carried the name, but refused to acknowledge it. One user described being told by her grandmother never to sign her name in certain ways, because it will call them back. Another posted that every time the name appeared in court cases, records later went missing. "It's like the name eats the paper," they wrote. Weeks later, the thread vanished along with the user account. What makes the name so dangerous is not only its recurrence, but its mutability. It does not stay fixed. It shifts surnames, attaches to different lineages, appears in files where it should not belong. Yet the handwriting remains the same, the presence unmistakable. To speak it is to invite its rewriting, to risk seeing it attached to your own record. Families who carried it often changed their names, moving counties, altering spellings. But the name followed. Always the same script, the same ghostly presence in files thought long destroyed. Was it a single man whose hand traveled across generations, or a family oath that required each son to mimic the same signature? Was it clerks conspiring to protect families or something stranger? A name that refuses to die, rewriting itself every time it is spoken or recorded? We cannot know. But the repetition is there, undeniable, carved into documents that survived courthouse fires, etched into Bibles that outlived their owners, whispered in songs children still hum today. And so, the name persists. You may not know it yet, but if you trace your family tree far enough into the ridges of Kentucky, West Virginia, or Virginia, you may find it waiting. Hiding in the margins of a census, scratched into a Bible, stamped onto a court file. If you speak it aloud, you may feel the weight of centuries pressing against you, a reminder that silence is not safety. If you've heard it, if your family warned you never to repeat it, if you've seen it scratched into wood, if you've noticed the same signature appearing across generations, write it, share it. Because only by speaking it together can we strip it of its power. The name rewrites itself when spoken alone. But spoken in chorus, it may finally be fixed, no longer a curse that passes silently through bloodlines, but a truth pinned to history where it belongs. Some stories were never meant to survive. The mountains kept them hidden, the families kept them quiet, and the officials kept them erased. And yet, fragments slipped through: a coroner's note pulled from a fire, a teacher's journal buried in a school ledger, a hymn remembered in a child's hum. These fragments tell us what no one wanted spoken aloud: that children were born into bloodlines already collapsing, that families sanctified silence with ritual, that names rewrote themselves to remain unseen. When you reach the end of this trail, courthouse ashes, abandoned cabins, whispers of hymns, you realize the truth is not that these families disappeared. It is that they were forced out of history. Their children buried without stones, their surnames erased from records, their stories mocked as folklore. But beneath the mockery lies evidence too consistent to ignore. Too many teachers reporting children who spoke in broken hymns. Too many coroners describing infants with inhumanly fused features. Too many signatures repeating across decades. This is not myth. This is memory. The files we were never meant to read tell us what the communities themselves already knew: that silence was protection, that exposure was death. For families who lived under this curse, secrecy was survival. If outsiders learned too much, children would be taken, homes condemned, reputations destroyed. And so, the silence was passed down like inheritance, a law stronger than scripture. It bound parents, pastors, sheriffs, even journalists, ensuring the truth never reached the surface. But silence does not kill memory. It only drives it deeper. You see it in the house that still stands, sagging but unbroken, its walls carved with crosses and spirals. You see it in the names that appear across records, rewriting themselves as if determined never to be pinned down. You hear it in children humming songs no one taught them, melodies identical to those recorded a century ago. The silence failed because the land remembers. And the land has a way of pushing memory back to the surface. Hollows flood, washing bones into creek beds. Forests burn, exposing foundations of cabins thought forgotten. Courthouse fires destroy files, but one page survives, tucked away in the wrong drawer, waiting to be found. Every act of erasure leaves behind a trace, and the traces have gathered, piece by piece, until they form a story we cannot ignore. The question now is whether we can bear to name it, to say aloud what generations tried to bury. Was it poverty that created this curse, or faith twisted into doctrine? Was it desperation, or devotion to a belief that blood itself was holy? Was it madness born of isolation, or a ritual passed down so long that even those who carried it forgot its origin? We may never know. What we do know is that children suffered, children were buried in silence, and families carried shame too heavy to bear. We know that officials erased records, that pastors preached silence, that witnesses vanished after speaking. We know that this is not just folklore, not just mountain myth. It is history. And history demands to be remembered, no matter how dark. Tonight the file is open. The names are spoken. The hymns are heard again. The silence is broken, even if only for a moment. And in breaking it, we honor those who never had voices of their own. The children born already damned, their lives cut short, their existence hidden in basements, cellars, and unmarked graves. If you recognize this story in your own family, if your grandmother warned you never to speak certain names, if your grandfather told you about courthouse fires, if your cousins look too much alike, if you've heard hymns and dreams you've never learned, write it. Let it be known. Because only when the silence is shattered can the truth be fixed in history where it belongs. And remember this: stories like these do not stay buried forever. They resurface when we least expect them, in songs hummed by children, in records pulled from ashes, in houses that refuse to fall. We were not meant to know this, but now that we do, we cannot turn away. If you recognize the name, if this story matches your family's silences, then write it. Let us see what they tried to erase. And subscribe, because even this video might vanish tomorrow the way the records once did.